It looks like they are actually in the middle of Game 3, so we will take a look at the board state as we do jump in and see exactly where we are at. Again, it is Reanimator versus Jeskai Stoneblade. Lossett on the Reanimator deck, BBD on Jeskai Stoneblade, 17 and 19 on the life totals. And we're going to be underway here. Stressful situation. Whoever wins this match moves on. Whoever loses is done for the weekend.
And for Joe Lossett, he has been here all weekend. And this has become familiar territory. He has already knocked 3 players out of the tournament yesterday. Managed to take down Kevin Jones, took out Logan Mize, and Chris Van Meter. He's hoping to add Braun-Duin to that list right now.
It's a brainstorm here for Joe. A card that we know he's very comfortable casting. Done it a lot in playing Miracles, but a different take today. He'll have to put 2 cards back and figure out how he wants to move forward with the grip. As far as Brian's concerned, again, we mentioned the Containment Priest that he does have in his sideboard. He's got a Council's Judgment, which does play a role in the matchup. Also 2 copies of Surgical Extraction. So cards that, again, I imagine he was playing just because they are good cards that happen to be pretty good against Reanimator.
And if you look at how the game has played out here right now, a lot of cantripping on the side for Brian. I'm not positive how many lands he has at the moment, though. You see, Meddling Mage has hit his graveyard, and he may be stuck on lands at the moment. I believe it was a discard due to hand size.
Yeah. Joe really trying to figure out exactly what cards he's supposed to put back with Brainstorm. It's always so difficult. It has such an impact on the game, on what cards you take, what cards you put back, and how to move forward with it. When he is done resolving Brainstorm, this is a Polluted Delta. And he wants to make sure that he doesn't mess up against an opponent who looks like they're having mana issues at this point.
Well, Seth has a lot of the pieces of the puzzle in his hand. He does have a copy of Exhume, of Gristlebrand, Animate Dead, and it looks like Abrupt Decay. I'm not sure he has a way to bin any of the creatures just yet.
And that might be the big problem. He's going to sacrifice a Delta and search up a land here. Let's see which one he's going to dig out. Volcanic Island. His mana base is a little all over the place. It is rather eccentric.
He does have to be careful here. So Brian kept a 1-lander, and while it hasn't worked out for him, you have to think Brian's a seasoned enough player that if he kept a 1-lander, I would expect at least 1 Force of Will out of him when I go for the combo turn.
Is it time for maybe...
I think he's going to Animate Dead the Meddling Mage.
He's getting creative.
Well, when you have a lot of reanimation, why not use some of it for some other gain? If you're worried about Force of Will, well, there's a pretty clean answer to that, and the fact that Brian played a Meddling Mage for you.
I do wonder if this resolves what he will name now. The Meddling Mage is going to be a 1-power creature because Animate Dead gives -1/-0, but the more important thing is what's the name going to be here for Lossett? And we'll get confirmation on exactly what that is in just a moment. That is an interesting play. And he will go with Surgical Extraction, a card that Joe probably lost to game 2, but Brian does have 2 copies of in his sideboard. Now here's a Gataxian Probe.
I really like that name from Joe. So when you think about the kind of cards that you want to name out from Brian here, Brian's stuck on 1 land, which means if Brian has a cantrip, he has to use it. Brian cannot afford to leave up mana. So what are the kind of cards I want to name for Fime Lossett? I think he wants to name the free spells, whether it's Force of Will or Surgical Extraction. Those are the most likely cards to matter. Surgical is a great name here for Lossett, as it's the most devastating if Brian has it.
Entomb, Gristlebrand, Exhume, Abrupt Decay, and Force of Will are the cards here for Joe Lossett. So Joe, I believe, is hoping to draw a blue card next turn.
Yeah, he has the whole package minus the blue card for Force of Will right now. And the reason he goes with Surgical Extraction is he can still entomb a creature and go for the reanimation spell without having a blue card. And if Brian Force of Wills it, so be it. He'll go for it again next turn. But if Brian were to Surgical that card that he puts in the graveyard, that is very bad for Joe, because then the second card, reanimation, you know, the Exhume doesn't do anything.
Joe getting creative, to say the least. With
I like his line.
No, I do
Heads
too.
up, man.
I do too. Let's see what this is going to be. Here's a Brainstorm.
Right, like I said, Brian just not able to afford to leave up mana here. He needs to hit lands if he wants a chance of winning this.
Brainstorm's going to resolve. Meddling Mage is 1. Flusterstorm is 2. I don't think it's a land. It's 3. It's a Vendilion Click.
No, it's a Vendilion Click. And this is going from a difficult draw from Brian to becoming something a lot worse. He hasn't completely brainstorm locked himself. He does have a ponder for next turn, so he can shuffle his deck if it comes to. However, this is quickly getting bad for Brian.
This is a very, very difficult spot. Brian, after a fantastic first day, made it through his group and advanced on to this morning, has not had it come together with a deck that he has won a Grand Prix with. He's made some changes. Not surprising, given it's a different tournament than the Grand Prix that he won. But these changes do not look like they've worked out. But then again, and we've said this a couple times, taking a look at the decks that people are playing, like Gerard, like Reed, like Joe, honestly. They came to kind of beat this kind of strategy, I feel like, this weekend.
The people came to beat Stoneblade, and for players like Brian came here to beat Stoneblade, or to beat Delver as well. 4 lightning bolts in his main deck. I can't imagine those have been too good for him in this pod. Reanimator, Sneak and Show, and Sultai Control. None of those are matchups where lightning bolt's a good card.
It's an attack here for 1 from the Meddling Mage. Joe drew a copy of Reanimate for the turn, so it does make you wonder if he's willing to move in here. Again, he does have an Entomb, Exhume, and Reanimate. No blue card to protect himself with, but he's protected against Surgical Extraction, and he's playing as a tapped-out opponent, so...
For me, the question is if he's going to reanimate Meddling Mage to name Force of Will first.
It's funny because it's there.
Yeah, well, actually, he doesn't have 3 black mana, so if he goes for that line, he can't Entomb... I think he ends up a little short, but it's not even that bad of a line.
No, he can just say, Reanimate, get your Meddling Mage, name...
And that's it.
Force of Will.
He's going to do it.
Yeah, and that's it. And then maybe I Entomb and Exhume. Maybe I don't.
Well, he knows Brian's not drawing a land next turn.
Yep.
Brian did brainstorm and not play land, so the next card's not a land. The worst case scenario is Brian has a cantrip, like Ponder, shuffles, finds a land, but Joe here, reanimating Meddling Mage, he's going to close off all of Brian's outs. First Surgical Extraction, and this one I do think is going to be on Force of Will.
I do wonder, as I have a feeling Chris Pikula is watching right now, I wonder how he feels about how his Meddling Mages are being used right now. Not for good, they're being used for evil. This was not the intended purpose of Brian's Meddling Mages. They're coming in, they're naming cards that are in Brian's deck that he would never name, and they are playing a huge role and beating Brian to death here. Now, Brian does look like have a copy of Force of Will, and we're going to find out what this is going to name right now, and I would be very surprised if it doesn't go with Force of Will.
Well, what Brian has to hope for is that he ponders into a land, it's a fetch land, he plays it, and then has a relevant counter spell. Joe has done himself a bit of a disservice by naming Force of Will. The Force of Will in Joe's hand has gotten worse.
Yes, I mean, that card is turned off in his hand now. This is definitely true, but, what he's trying to do, of course, is just carve a path for Entomb plus Exhume. That's all he's trying to do right now.
If you don't want to fight a counter war, you can just Meddling Mage all your opponent's relevant cards.
Yeah, the other Meddling Mage is naming Force of Will, so there's one out there on Surgical Extraction. There's another one out there on Force of Will.
All the free cards in Brian's deck cannot be cast.
Here's a Ponder. Joe's going to respond, it looks like.
Yeah, and a great time for an Entomb here.
There is Entomb. We'll see what he wants to search up. A couple of options here for Joe. He does have a Sphinx of the Steel one in his main deck. Siren Sanity, Tidespout, Tyrant as well. Gristlebrand, of course, 4 copies of that, and then an Elishnorn too, if he wants to maybe speed things up a little bit. In his sideboard, he does have an Iona hanging out as well. So some decent options here for Joe, but he's going to go with the industry standard there in Gristlebrand.
Yeah, on a board that a lot of those things are specific tools for specific situations, but when you just need a really big hammer, Gristlebrand is the go-to guy. It's why the deck plays 4.
Brian going to cast a Ponder, gets to keep one of these if he'd like, or he can shuffle away. A little mystery action. But boy, is he in a bind right now, because not only does he have to worry about the Gristlebrand in the graveyard and the fact that Joe could potentially bring it back, but he's also getting beaten down for 3 a turn right now, given those Meddling Mages that are out there.
Yeah, the Meddling Mages do have Brian on a 5-turn clock right now. The big concern for Brian is that if he doesn't hit a land off this Ponder, he probably wasn't winning the game no matter how it progressed.
Yeah.
And you can only miss your land drops for so long. But yeah, you'd assume because of how Joe's played this, that Joe's going to go ahead and try to reanimate Gristlebrand in some form. Brian does have a land. He has a Volcanic Island. The question is, what interaction does he actually have?
And is Joe even willing to play around it either at this point? Joe's done such a nice job of shutting off Brian's options.
Spell Pierce is probably at the top of Joe's list of cards to be concerned about.
Brian going to pass the turn back. Joe will draw. Didn't get a great look at it, but he's going to start by attacking for 3. Brian going to go down to 11. And perhaps it's time to cast an Exhume.
Yeah, and there is land number 4 in Joe's hand, so if he wants to Exhume, he can play around Spell Pierce.
He'll play the land.
Now, the Gristlebrand, normally when you Exhume a Gristlebrand in this deck, it is lights out, because if your opponent ever tries to remove the Gristlebrand, you just simply draw cards and Force of Will it. Now, Joe has Meddling Maged Force of Will, which means if Brian can get, say, has a Swords to Plowshares in hand, finds a white mana source, casts it on the Gristlebrand, Joe won't actually have much of a way of protecting it. He may just lose the creature.
Oh, here's Exhume. And Brian is reaching for mana, and he has a copy of Pyroblast that is going after the Meddling Mage that is on Surgical Extraction.
And that may just do it. If he has the Surgical, and I believe he does, he's going to hit Gristlebrand. And Brian he's showing some life here all of a sudden.
He needed to hit that land to make this play available, and he has. And Joe can't Force of Will back for multiple reasons. One of them is that Meddling Mage is in play on Force of Will, and the other is he doesn't have another blue card in his hand, so Brian has a little bit of life here. And all the Gristlebrands are gone.
Yeah, Joe is going to have to put the combo back together. He's going to need not only another creature in the graveyard, but another way to get it out. It's just Meddling Mage right now dealing 2 a turn. And granted, Brian is down to 9. He dealt some damage with that Surgical.
And now Brian gets, oh my gosh, now Brian
Exhume resolves.
Yeah, the Exhume resolves. And now Brian gets Meddling Mage back.
And he got to see Joe's hand.
Yes, he did. He knows there's Abrupt Decay and there's a Force of Will there, so now we'll see what he names.
So Joe's hand could be Force of Will. Joe's hand right now is Force of Will, Abrupt Decay. There's a Meddling Mage in play on Force of Will and a Meddling Mage in play on Abrupt Decay. And
now Brian's going for a cruise.
Well, when you've had to discard cards due to hand size all game, Treasure Cruise sure can help out. You have plenty of fodder for it.
So Brian's going to draw 3 cards, Source of Plowshares, a Polluted Delta, and a Volcanica, and now he's finally found some lands.
What a turn of events here. Brian just stuck on 1 land for so long, and showing life here, may be able to beat, he may get this game just yet.
Oh, he is moving a little bit faster now as he does attack for 2 points of damage. Now, you take a look at Brian's hand, there are 2 Force of Wills over there, and those are off. Now Joe's going to do some attacking with Brian's Meddling Mage, so he'll come across. However, Brian's going to quickly sacrifice a Polluted Delta, might be hunting for a Tundra, and he is.
Swords to Plowshares in Brian's hand. He may just use that on Joe's Meddling Mage. Joe drew Careful Study for the turn, and certainly has 2 cards to discard. Both the cards in his hand currently are uncastable due to Meddling Mage.
Well, his Force of Will has been turned back on. Swords of Plowshares is going to go after that. The problem here, if you're Joe, is that Brian has 2 copies of Force of Will in his hand, so he actually has some defense. Will Joe cast Careful Study? The answer is yes. Will Brian let it resolve?
I mean, Brian has a full grip here. Not only did he have tons of spells in his hand, but then he was able to resolve Treasure Cruise. There's a lot of stuff for Joe to fight through.
Now keep in mind, Joe is without Gristlebrands now. They're all gone thanks to Surgical Extraction. Joe's got to figure out what 2 cards to discard. He's got a Brainstorm, a Force of Will. Abrupt Decay and Polluted Delta, the cards are going to go away. So Brainstorm and Force of Will stay, and a passing of the turn back to Brian. Brian quickly going to draw a card. And you can see how the pace of play has shifted here in a big way for Brian. When we joined this match, it was hands on head discarding. And now it is probing quickly, treasure cruising, drawing cards.
This is unreal.
And attacking for 2. Lossett's down to 13.
Brian sees his hand. It's a Brainstorm and Force of Will. Brian is confident enough here that even at 6, he's paying life for his Jataxian Probes. He knows the tide has turned.
That Brainstorm's getting countered. He can't counter that fast enough with the Power Blast. Now here's him dealing click, and he is really putting the pedal to the metal. The grip is Force of Will and Bloodstained Mind. You have to imagine those cards are going to stay right there as Brian's going to write them down, quickly untap and take a draw step.
5 power on the board means it's only 3 attacks that it'll take to kill Joe here. Brian knows that neither of the cards in Joe's hand do much to stop it right now. He just has to survive a couple more turns.
It's an attack for 5. Lossette's down to 8. Joe will draw. He'll just have to pass the turn back. Brian will untap. He's in for 5. Joe is down to 3. Brian has 2 Force of Wills in his hand. Joe draws a card, and that is going to do it. Brian Braun-Duin wins that match over Joe Lossett. 2 games to 1, and much like me and you in the booth, we can't believe it.
And Joe Lossett, the man who seemingly would not go down on day 1, lost game 1 of elimination matches 3 times, battled back. The roles are reversed. He takes game 1, but this time it's Brian with the comeback. And for Joe Lossett, that is going to be all for the tournament. He will be finishing in 7th or 8th place.
Yeah, both of these players will have 1 and 2 records, but Brian has a tiebreaker over Joe as he just defeated him. So that means that for Joe Lossett, after hanging on many times, his day is done.